Murdered in custody. Unsolved inmate deaths of the 1890s. Some men entered prison alive and never came out the same. Their deaths were called accidents, but the truth was buried. This is a real American story they didn't want remembered. Subscribe now, because once you hear this, you won't forget it. The guard opened the cell at dawn. The man inside was supposed to be asleep. Instead, he was lying still on the cold stone floor. His face was pale. His eyes were half open. His body had bruises no one could explain. By the time the prison doctor arrived, it was already decided what the report would say. Natural causes. That was all it took. No trial, no questions, no justice. In the 1890s, this happened again and again inside American prisons. Men went in alive and came out dead, and the truth died with them. Some were common prisoners. Others were immigrant anarchists locked away by the federal government and labeled as dangerous enemies. What happened behind those walls was hidden from the public, buried under paperwork and fear. And this death was only the beginning. What no one outside the prison knew was that this man had begged to see a lawyer just days earlier. He had told another inmate that if anything happened to him, it would not be an accident. Now he was gone, and the prison doors closed like nothing had happened. But whispers spread through the cell blocks, and one question refused to disappear. Who was next? The story begins years earlier, when America was changing fast and fear was spreading even faster. Cities were growing, factories were loud and dangerous. Workers protested for better lives. Some followed radical ideas like anarchism, believing the government was corrupt and violent. After events like the Haymarket bombing in 1886, fear took over the nation. Police and federal agents began arresting men not just for crimes, but for beliefs. Many of them were immigrants. German, Italian, Eastern European workers were watched closely. If they spoke against the government, they were arrested. Some were given long federal sentences. Others were sent to state prisons where conditions were already cruel. Prisons in the 1890s were not places of safety. They were places of silence and control. Guards held absolute power. Inmates had no real rights. Complaints disappeared. Injuries went unreported, and deaths were rarely questioned. At Sing Sing Prison in New York, several inmates died under unclear circumstances during this period. Official reports often listed causes like heart failure or illness, but fellow prisoners told a different story. They spoke of beatings, punishment cells, and men collapsing after long nights of questioning. Families wrote letters begging for answers. Most never received replies. At Eastern State Penitentiary in Pennsylvania, isolation was used as punishment. Prisoners were kept alone for months, sometimes years. Some were found dead in their cells with no clear cause. Doctors blamed weakness. Guards blamed disobedience. The system blamed no one. For immigrant anarchists, the danger was even greater. They were seen as threats, not people. Guards treated them as examples. Federal prisoners accused of radical beliefs were isolated, watched closely, and punished harshly for small rule breaks. When one of them died, the explanation was simple. He was unstable. He brought it on himself. No investigation followed. One Italian anarchist held in federal custody in the early 1900s reportedly collapsed after repeated punishment sessions. Other inmates later said he had been warned to stay quiet about mistreatment. His death certificate listed exhaustion. His family was never allowed to see his body. The public never heard his name. Newspapers rarely reported inmate deaths unless violence spilled outside prison walls. Prisons were sealed worlds. What happened inside stayed inside. But inside those walls, fear was constant. Inmates learned quickly not to speak too loudly. They learned not to ask questions. They learned that a man could vanish overnight and be replaced by silence in the morning.
And yet, some still talked. They whispered about guards who went too far, about punishments that lasted too long, about men who entered punishment cells healthy and never came out alive. These stories never reached courtrooms. They lived only in memory. By the late 1990s, reformers began to raise concerns. A few journalists tried to look closer at prison deaths. What they found was a pattern, not proof. Missing records, vague medical notes, wardens protecting their own. No guard was ever convicted. No official was removed, and the deaths continued.
The man found on the stone floor that morning was not the first. He would not be the last. His death joined a long list of names that history nearly erased. Some were criminals, some were political prisoners. All were human beings. As the prison bell rang and the day moved on, his cell was cleaned. Another inmate would soon take his place. The system did not stop. It never did. But somewhere in the prison, someone had seen too much, and that person knew the next death would not be quiet. It would be impossible to ignore. And when it came, it would expose everything the prisons of the 1890s were desperate to hide. Stay with me, because what happens next turns suspicion into terror and silence into something far more dangerous. The scream came just before lights out. It was short, sharp, then silence. Every man in the cell block froze. No one moved. No one spoke. They all knew the rule. If you react, you become visible. If you become visible, you become a target. By morning, another inmate was dead. The guards said he slipped in the wash area. The doctor said it was an accident. The report was written before the body was cold. But the men who lived behind those bars knew the truth. This was not an accident. This was punishment. And now the prison was changing. After the first death, inmates whispered. After the second, they stopped whispering. Fear took over. Men slept with one eye open. Some refused food. Others stopped speaking at all. The silence inside the prison grew heavier than the iron doors. This was how prisons in the 1890s worked. Control came first. Truth came last. At Sing Sing Prison, records show multiple inmate deaths listed under the same vague causes within months of each other. Heart failure, sudden illness, weak constitution. But these men were young. Some had arrived healthy. Others had been seen walking hours before they were found dead. No outside doctor was allowed in. Wardens ran their prisons like private kingdoms. Guards answered only to them. Complaints from inmates were treated as lies. Complaints from families were ignored. One former inmate later described it simply. Once you were inside, your life belonged to the prison. For immigrant anarchists, the danger grew even worse. They were marked men. Federal authorities believed anarchists were planning violence even from inside their cells. As a result, they were watched constantly. Letters were censored or destroyed. Visits were denied. Any sign of resistance brought punishment. One German-born labor organizer imprisoned in the 1890s was repeatedly placed in solitary confinement for speaking to other inmates. Fellow prisoners later said he came out shaking, thin, and confused. Days later, he collapsed during forced labor. The report said exhaustion. The truth stayed locked inside the prison walls. At Eastern State Penitentiary, the isolation system continued to break minds. Prisoners were kept alone in small cells with no human contact. Some began talking to walls. Others screamed for hours. Guards were told not to respond. When inmates died in isolation, there were no witnesses. One death followed another, always quiet, always unexplained. Outside the prisons, America was afraid. Newspapers warned of anarchist threats. Politicians promised safety. Prisons became places where fear was buried instead of solved. Anyone labeled dangerous could disappear behind bars without public concern. That fear protected the system. But not everyone stayed silent. In the late 1900s, a former guard broke ranks.
He spoke privately to a reform group about what he had seen. He described beatings used as discipline. He described punishment cells where men were left without food. He described orders to look the other way. His words never reached court. The prisons denied everything. Inside, the deaths continued. Inmates began to understand something terrifying. These deaths were not mistakes, they were warnings. A man who spoke too much, a man who refused orders, a man who held radical beliefs, all could be made examples, and no one would come looking. One night, an immigrant prisoner passed a note to another man through a crack in the wall. It said only one sentence: "If I die, remember my name." The next morning, his cell was empty. The guards said he had been transferred. No one ever saw him again. By now, inmates stopped asking questions. Survival meant silence. But fear has a way of spreading faster than obedience. Tension filled the air. Guards noticed it. Wardens felt it. Something was building. Then came the death that could not be hidden. During a work detail, an inmate collapsed in full view of others. He did not fall quietly. He cried out. Men rushed toward him before guards could stop them. His face was bruised. His ribs were broken. Blood stained his clothes. Too many witnesses.
The prison locked down immediately. Inmates were threatened with punishment if they spoke, but rumors escaped the walls anyway. A local paper briefly mentioned an incident. No names were printed. No investigation followed. Families demanded answers. The prison gave none. That moment cracked the system just slightly. Reformers pushed harder. Questions grew louder. But prisons closed ranks. Records disappeared. Witnesses were moved. Truth was delayed. And delay was all the system needed. By the end of the decade, dozens of inmate deaths remained unexplained. Immigrant anarchists continued to receive long sentences. Some would never leave prison alive. Their names faded from memory, replaced by silence and fear. But inside the walls, the inmates remembered. They remembered the screams. They remembered the empty cells. They remembered the lies written on official paper. And they knew something else. If the truth ever came out, it would shake the country. Because these were not just deaths. They were murders hidden behind bars. And someone, somewhere, was getting closer to proving it. Don't turn away now, because the next chapter begins where the lies finally start to break. The file vanished the same night the inmate was buried. It had been signed, it had been logged, it had been placed in the prison records room, and by morning it was gone. No report, no witness statements, no cause of death beyond two careless words: unknown illness. That was when the truth became dangerous. By the late 1890s, pressure was building outside prison walls. Reformers, doctors, and a few brave journalists began asking why so many inmates were dying in custody, why their bodies showed marks that did not match the reports, why immigrant anarchists in particular seemed to vanish without explanation. Prisons responded the only way they knew how. They erased evidence. Wardens denied access. Guards were warned to stay silent. Inmates who talked were punished. Some were transferred suddenly. Others were placed in isolation. A few were never seen again. One reform-minded doctor was allowed to briefly examine prison medical records in the Northeast. What he found shocked him. Pages torn out, dates altered, causes of death repeated word for word, even for men who had died in very different ways. When he asked questions, his access was revoked. The system had closed. Inside the prisons, fear turned into something heavier. It was no longer just fear of death. It was fear of being forgotten. Inmates began carving names on walls. They whispered names at night so they would not disappear. One immigrant anarchist, imprisoned on federal charges, wrote letters that were never sent. He hid them inside his mattress, describing beatings and threats. He wrote that he believed he would die in custody. He was found dead weeks later.
His letters were never recovered. Across the country, similar stories repeated. In Ohio, a prisoner collapsed after punishment duty and died within hours. In Pennsylvania, an inmate was found lifeless in isolation, his last recorded meal days earlier. In New York, another death was labeled sudden weakness, even though fellow inmates heard shouting the night before. No guard was charged, no trial followed. The public saw none of it. The fear of anarchism protected the prisons. Officials argued that these men were dangerous, that strict control was necessary, that harsh treatment saved lives outside prison walls, and many Americans believed them. But the truth was simpler. Prisons had learned they could kill without consequence. As the decade ended, a small group of reformers tried one last time to expose the pattern. They gathered testimonies from former inmates, dismissed guards, and grieving families. They saw the same details again and again: injuries before death, silence afterward, paperwork that explained nothing. They prepared to publish. Then came the warning. One reformer received an anonymous letter. It told him to stop digging. It said prisons were protected by powerful people. It said pushing further would end careers and lives. The message was clear. Some backed away. Others did not. A short report was released anyway. It did not accuse specific guards. It did not name murderers. It simply asked a question the country had avoided. Why were so many inmates dying without answers? The response was swift. Prisons dismissed the claims. Politicians called them exaggerated. Newspapers moved on to louder stories. And once again, the dead were buried beneath silence. By 1900, the wave of fear shifted. New laws came. New prisons were built. But the deaths of the 1890s remained unsolved. The men who died in custody never received justice. Their families never received truth. Their names faded, but their story did not end. Because what happened in those prisons changed America forever. It taught the system what it could get away with. It showed how fear could erase accountability. It laid the foundation for how political prisoners and labeled enemies would be treated in the future. Locked away, isolated, forgotten. And when they died, the world would be told it was an accident. Even today, historians still uncover fragments, a name in a ledger, a missing page, a letter that should not exist. Each discovery raises the same question: how many were murdered in custody? And how many will never be known?
The prisons of the 1890s did not just hold men, they buried truths. They shaped the justice system where silence became policy and fear became protection. And once a system learns that lesson, it never truly forgets it. Because the walls that hid these deaths are still standing, and the silence they created still echoes today. The door was already open when the investigator arrived. That was wrong. Prison doors were never left open. Not for visitors, not for officials, not for anyone. But this one stood wide, like someone wanted him to see inside. The cell was empty. No body, no blood, no struggle. Just a thin mattress on the floor and deep scratches carved into the stone wall. Letters, names, dates, some crossed out, some unfinished. The investigator stood still. He understood at once. Another man had disappeared. Not transferred, not released, erased. By the year 1900, something dangerous was happening behind American prison walls. It was not just death anymore. It was disappearance. Men were no longer dying in custody. They were vanishing from it, and no one could prove how. The federal government had begun tightening its grip on immigrant anarchists. New laws allowed longer sentences. Prison officials were given more power. Oversight was weak. Fear was strong, and silence was rewarded. In this system, death was easy to explain. Disappearance was even easier. Records showed an inmate entered prison. Years later, the record simply stopped. No death date, no release date, just nothing. Families wrote letters for years. Some never learned what happened. Others were told their loved one had died of illness, even though no grave could be found. Prisons blamed paperwork errors. But inside the walls, inmates knew better. They spoke quietly of night removals, of guards calling names after midnight, of cells left empty by morning. They said some men were taken to punishment areas and never returned. Others believed bodies were moved, buried on prison land, or sent away under false names. No proof survived, because proof did not live long. One former inmate later said the safest lie was silence. If you asked questions, you became a problem. Problems were solved quickly and quietly. The investigator began collecting what little evidence remained. Old intake logs, medical notes, guard rosters. Patterns appeared. Certain guards worked during multiple unexplained deaths. Certain wardens signed every final report. Certain prisons had far more natural deaths than others. Still, nothing was enough to bring charges. The system protected itself. In one case, an immigrant anarchist had been sentenced to 15 years in federal custody. He survived only 4. His family was told he died suddenly. When they asked where he was buried, no one could answer. When they asked for his belongings, they were told they were lost. Even his name was misspelled in the records. That was how the prisons worked. If you could not be found on paper, you did not exist. By the early 1900s, prison reform slowly began to gain support. New rules were discussed, inspections were promised, but the men who had already died were beyond help. Their stories were trapped in fragments. A letter here, a scratch on a wall there, a missing page. Some historians believe dozens died this way. Others believe it was far more. The truth may never be known, because the prisons of the 1890s were built to forget, and they succeeded. The investigators' report was never published in full. Parts were removed, names were withheld, causes of death were softened. What remained was careful and quiet, enough to raise concern, not enough to force change. Once again, the dead were buried by silence, but something had shifted. For the first time, Americans began to question what happened after conviction. Not just crime, but punishment. Not just guilt, but power. Prisons were no longer seen only as places of justice. They were places where justice could disappear. The inmate scratches on the wall were eventually cleaned. New prisoners arrived. New guards took over. Time moved forward, but the system stayed the same. Fear still ruled. Men labeled dangerous were still isolated. Immigrants were still watched more closely. Complaints still vanished. And when someone died in custody, the words on the report were still simple. Natural causes, sudden illness, accident. The truth remained locked behind stone and steel. Today, when historians look back, they see more than old prisons. They see the beginning of a pattern, a lesson learned by the system, that if the public is afraid enough, it will stop asking questions. The inmates of the 1890s paid the price for that lesson. They were murdered in custody. They were locked away forever, and most of them were never named. Their stories survive only because silence never fully wins. Someone always remembers. Someone always digs. Someone always notices what shouldn't be there. Like an open door, an empty cell, a missing file. And once you see it, you can never unsee it. Because the prisons may have buried the truth, but the truth never stays buried forever. The coffin was sealed before the family arrived. They were told not to open it. They were told the body was fragile. They were told this was for their own good. A prison official stood nearby, watching closely, making sure no one asked the wrong question.
Inside that coffin was a man who entered prison alive and strong. Inside that coffin was also the truth, but no one was allowed to see it. By the early 1900s, families of dead inmates had learned a painful lesson. When the prison called, it was already too late. The death had already been explained. The paperwork had already been signed.
The story had already been decided, and it never changed. He was sick. He was weak. He caused his own death. For families of immigrant anarchists, the pain was even deeper. Many lived far from the prisons where their loved ones were held. Some did not speak English well. Others feared the government. When letters stopped coming, they hoped it was a mistake. Then a short notice arrived. Deceased. No details, no apology, no answers. Some families demanded autopsies. They were refused. Others asked for personal belongings. They were told the items were lost or destroyed. A few tried to sue. Their cases went nowhere. The system did not bend. Inside the prisons, inmates watched these moments closely. They saw the guards change behavior when deaths attracted attention. They saw bodies moved at night instead of day. They saw paperwork rewritten. They saw cells cleaned too quickly. They understood something terrifying. The prisons were learning how to hide better. One former inmate later said that after each suspicious death, rules tightened. Silence was enforced more harshly. Punishment became faster and quieter. Guards no longer shouted. They no longer threatened. They simply acted. And that made everything worse. In one prison, an inmate known for keeping track of deaths marked dates on the inside of his cell wall. He wrote names when he could. When names were unknown, he wrote numbers, one mark for each man who died. When guards discovered the markings, the wall was scrubbed clean. The inmate was moved to isolation. He did not survive the year. Outside the walls, prison reform slowly became a public issue. Reports of abuse, overcrowding, and corruption reached lawmakers. A few inspections were ordered, but inspections were announced in advance. Wardens prepared, guards behaved, inmates were warned to stay quiet. Inspectors saw clean halls and calm faces. They left satisfied. What they did not see were the punishment cells, the isolation units, the records rooms where files disappeared, the burial orders signed without witnesses. The deaths of the 1890s slipped quietly into history, but their impact did not, because prisons remembered what they had learned, that fear could protect them, that labeled enemies could be treated without mercy, that deaths behind bars could be erased with ink and silence. This lesson carried forward. Years later, new groups would be labeled dangerous, new prisoners would be isolated, new deaths would be questioned and then forgotten. The pattern did not begin in the 20th century. It began here. With the murdered inmates of the 1890s, with immigrant anarchists locked away forever, with prisons that answered only to themselves. Today, historians still search through old ledgers and broken records. They find names crossed out, dates missing, causes of death that make no sense. Each discovery confirms what inmates already knew back then. These men did not die by chance. They died in a system that allowed it. And the most painful truth is this: justice was not denied by mistake. It was denied on purpose, because asking the right questions would have exposed too much. It would have shown how power works when no one is watching. It would have forced America to face what was done in its name. So the questions were buried instead, along with the bodies. But silence never lasts forever. Every forgotten inmate leaves something behind: a letter, a rumor, a scratch in a wall, a story passed from cell to cell. These fragments survive longer than lies. And when enough fragments come together, the truth begins to breathe again. The prisons of the 1890s tried to erase their dead. They failed, because today you are hearing their story. And in the next chapter, the focus turns to the moment history almost changed. The moment when one mistake, one witness, and one missing file threatened to expose everything. The moment when silence nearly broke. Stay with me, because what happens next is the closest these forgotten men ever came to justice. The witness almost made it out. He had waited years for the right moment. Years of silence, years of watching men disappear, years of pretending he saw nothing while writing everything down in his head. When he finally spoke, it was not loud, it was not public, it was enough. And that nearly destroyed everything.
He was a former prison clerk, a small job that most guards ignored. His work was paper, names, dates, transfers, death notices, the kind of work no one thought twice about. That was why he survived as long as he did. He knew where the lies lived. He knew which deaths had no bodies, which names appeared twice, which inmates vanished between lines of ink. When he left the prison, he carried copies in his memory, not papers, not letters, just patterns. And patterns were dangerous. At first, no one listened. He spoke to a local reform group. They nodded, took notes, and warned him to be careful. He spoke to a journalist. The journalist asked for proof. Proof did not exist anymore. It had been shredded, burned, rewritten. Still, the witness kept talking. And then something strange happened. One old death certificate resurfaced. It did not match the prison story. The name was wrong. The date was off. The cause of death had been changed twice. It was small, easy to dismiss, but it cracked the wall just enough for light to get in. Questions followed. Why was this man listed as dying in prison when another record showed he had been transferred weeks earlier? Why there was no burial record? Why did 3 guards sign a form that should have required only 1? The prison reacted fast. Officials denied everything. They said the records were old and unreliable. They said mistakes happened. They said critics were stirring fear for attention. Then, the witness disappeared. Not arrested, not charged, gone. His landlord said he left suddenly. His belongings were still in his room. His last conversation had been tense. He had said people were watching him. No one saw him again. The reform group fell silent. The journalist dropped the story. And once more, the system held. This was the final lesson of the 1890s prison deaths. Not just that inmates could be killed, but that anyone who came too close could be erased in other ways. Careers ended, reputations were destroyed, stories died quietly. By the time the public turned its attention elsewhere, the moment had passed. The country moved forward. New laws, new fears, new enemies. The prisons remained, locked, protected, unchanged. The men who died inside them never saw justice. The immigrant anarchists never had their names cleared. The inmate deaths remained unsolved, officially unexplained, quietly accepted. History recorded almost nothing, but silence does not mean nothing happened. It means someone worked very hard to make sure it was forgotten. Today, when historians study prison systems, they return to this period again and again, not because of what was proven, but because of what was missing. The gaps are too perfect, the patterns too clean, the excuses too familiar. Something was hidden here, and it shaped everything that came after. The prisons of the modern era did not appear by accident. They were built on lessons learned in the 1890s, lessons about control, about fear, about how far authority could go when the public was afraid enough.
Those early inmates were the test, and they failed it. Not because they were weak, but because the system was stronger. The scratches on the walls are gone now. The cells have been rebuilt. Some prisons were torn down. Others still stand. Tourists walk through them. Guides talk about architecture and reform. They rarely talk about the dead. They rarely talk about the missing. But the truth is still there, in records that do not match, in names that vanish, in deaths that make no sense. And once you notice it, you start seeing it everywhere. That is the legacy of the murdered in custody. That is the legacy of those locked away forever. They did not just die in prison. They revealed what prison could become. And the question they left behind still matters today. If no one is watching, what happens behind locked doors? If fear controls the story, who decides the truth? If silence protects power, who pays the price? The inmates of the 1890s already answered that question with their lives. And their answer should still disturb us. Because systems do not change on their own. They change only when people refuse to look away. When someone listens to whispers. When someone follows the missing file instead of ignoring it. That almost happened once. And it could happen again. Stay with this story. because the past is not finished speaking, and what it reveals next may sound uncomfortably familiar. These men were silenced, but their story doesn't end here. Every subscribe helps keep the truth alive. If this story disturbed you, that means it matters. Subscribe and stay with us as we uncover what history tried to erase.